afternoon. Once again, it is my privilege and pleasure to come and spend these few moments of your time. Everyone is watching the world as it unfolds, not just those beings on one's own planet, but, shall we say, in the entirety of the evolutionary focus within and without, shall we say, then because what is occurring is an experiment which has not, shall we say, happened previously. That is the transitionary phase between, shall we say, an endemically physicalized entities, that is, ones who have forgotten where they come from, and those that are waking up to the powerful nature that they truly are. So, shall we say, as it turns out, as, shall we say, the two universes separate, as we have already spoken about, it is not, shall we say, as much a physical as it is a conscious revolution. That is enough for us to begin a conversation.
Thank you. It's really good to be here again with you today. Now, I'd like to spend the next 2 or 3 sessions possibly talking to you about dimensions, realities, concurrent lives, planets, and life. So I was wondering if you could first start us off by giving us your higher perspective on what Earth really is and why are we all here?
As has been noted by many, the world, the physical world as you see it is, shall we say, the reduction of energy into solid matter in order, shall we say, to experience results. That is, shall we say, as the condensation of higher thought comes into manifestation as mental, that is, ideas and considerations, then it is materialized by, shall we call them, desires. Not just desires for what one wants, but desires for what one avoids. So, shall we say, resistances as much as one's desires. That physicalizes by creating the nature of time. Time then solidifies a framework of dimensions. So often one considers that dimensions as such are somehow spiritual. I want to say, as we have pointed out, spirit is a condition, not a place, not a framework as such, but a state of beingness, importation of one's concerns and one's understandings of consciousness itself. So shall we say then that as dimensions become formalized, that is in structures by the nature of systems, that is when one begins, if you like, when one starts to emerge into a direction, then one inculcates the first and direction number one, that is a movement in a particular frame. One could say that is the evolutionary purpose of all that is. In order for that to be able to be experienced as such, then it has to extend itself by a new direction. That is direction number two, the plane of existence, of which every thing is a location. So, shall we say number two? One is located. You understand, this is the physicalization. One is located in a particular position. When that occurs, one has a certain degree of movement outside of the single direction. One is then has a certain extra freedom. In order, shall we say, to fully experience that freedom, one has to raise oneself, number three. So 3 dimensions are the location, direction, and ability to experience freedom. And that for many centuries was all that was necessary in order to build, shall we say, a encyclopedia of experience. At a certain point, however, it was needed that what one did in the past must be able to be repeated. In repetition, then, one extends all of these previous directions along the time frame. Time then comes into existence as if it is as real as any of the other directions. But you have to understand, none of them are anything more than, shall we say, frames of reference. And so one is physicalized by such directions. Then you come to the next, shall we say, dimension, the 5th as it is, where one stands outside of the experience as observer to it. Now, this obviously is not a physical dimension as such. So trying to measure it with physical devices will not make any sense at all. And that is one of the difficulties that science has had, because it attempts to measure, shall we say, the cosmos physical devices, and it isn't possible to do that because you require a cosmological analysis, a device that is capable of interpreting such frameworks. So then you arrive at the unenviable position that there must be millions of universes. And one has to have, shall we say, millions of oneself in each one of these millions of universes, and so on it goes. And that is not necessarily so stupid an idea when you take the physicality out of it. Then you can see every thing that has, shall we say, a consciousness is the center of its own universe, and as such is capable of perceiving everything and everyone else as differently as they would see themselves. You understand, everyone has their own perceptions. And that is, shall we call it, an observational platform within what is apparently a four-dimensional space-time continuum. Does this make some sort of sense?
Yeah.
Then, if one were to take this another step further, beyond the observational, then one would appear in sixth level called the creational. Then one is creating some framework in which another part of self can observe what the consequences of actions really are. Do you understand? This is beginning to get to a point where human consciousness as individual cannot go beyond, because beyond that, at seventh level, there is no separation of individualities. All of the universes, of course, collapse into one interactive framework, which is indescribable in physical terms. I want to say that is quite a big ask to understand.
Yeah. I was wondering if maybe you could elaborate a little bit more about parallel realities.
This is I want to say, of course, every universe is paralleled to every other. And often there is, shall we say, interactions between those that are comparable. In other words, if you are in my reality, then of course I might allow certain bleeding from your reality into mine. So you might affect, or I might allow affection of one reality to the next. Then one might, alongside of that, be influenced, shall we say, by the shift in perceptions from one of your realities to another. In other words, if one was meditating, shall we say, and considering another person's experiential point of view, then and they were in some fashion putting themselves in that perspective, and from that position decide that reality is somewhat more to their liking, shall we say, by shifting their consciousness into the new framework, their own reality would, shall we say, no longer be focused in consciousness. You understand? So they would then experience a different nature. In other words, a shift in their own framework and perceptions. Do you follow what I mean? So each one of your decisions that you make in life, shall we say, has its own pathway. And it will unfold depending on the level of consciousness and thoughts that that particular aspect of self relies on. But it will not be something one would experience because one is not focused in it. Does that make some sort of sense? So you seem to have one reality in which you are focused upon. One reality that is consistent over time. In other words, seems to be a continual thread. But if you look backwards over your life, you may find yourself at, shall we call them, critical points, where if you look at it, you do not seem to follow the path that the previous part of your life would have suggested. Does that make sense? So if you are in, shall we say, a habitual pathway, you are going down a certain road, it seems as if that is going to have a certain outcome, and suddenly, for some unknown reason, your life changes. As if you had slipped from one train to another. As if you had arrived at a station, quickly nipped off the one train and onto another. And now you are moving in a different direction. Over time, you forget that you have swapped. And it seems as if you were always on the same train, of course, because you were always going to the transitionary station. Does this make some sort of sense?
Yeah, so is it just at critical points in your life, or is it maybe you're influenced by somebody else and your perception gets shifted, and can you easily and fluidly change realities from one to another and then potentially back again?
There is a requirement in the determination, shall we say. One creates reality by the framework perceptions that you hold. If you do not shift those, then you will continue in the direction that is ordained, if you like. If someone provides enough impetus to change, then one would almost certainly not perceive that one has actually changed anything. It would simply be so fluid that the new reality would seem as if normal. Does that make sense? Consciousness then always appears as if it is continuous. Contiguous, I think, is a better word. Does that make some? Do you follow what I'm saying? Because, of course, one can change reality much more fluidly than one suspects. And some people demonstrate this. For example, they have a certain life that has not served them, and suddenly, in a matter of perhaps hours, they are a different person altogether. Often this occurs at critical junctions. Shall we say, someone who is not a nice person ends up in a criminal institution, and suddenly they awaken to their predicament, and they do something that is less than normal, which is they take responsibility for it. In taking the responsibility, they are acknowledging that they made a fatal mistake, shall we say. And in doing that, suddenly they unleash a new paradigm for themselves. They start to see the results of many things that led to that mistake, misinterpretation, and begin to take their lives back in hand. Such people often turn out to be much wiser than those that did not make any mistakes and did not own anything. Do you follow what I mean? So if you really want to shift your life, then take responsibility for where it is in the present. Do you understand? If you want to have a different experience, stop, shall we say, rejecting the experience that you have. Denial will not make it occur.